Hey everybody, welcome back. I just wanted to record this because there are a couple of questions about reviewing the California energy crisis and the regulations that were associated with it and kind of the concepts therein. And I was writing out a big long explanation. I thought maybe a video would be more helpful, so let's try that and hopefully it's a little bit quicker. So the big idea with the California energy crisis is first that electricity generation tends to be a natural monopoly market, right? It's got high fixed costs associated with creating these massive generators that create the electricity, and then it is transmitted to a distribution center that retails the electricity to households. That's that vertical integration. And so think about the idea that there's like a big, massive generator creating electricity with one resource or another, some method, and then it's going to be transmitted, right? And then distributed, and then retail is when it's actually sent to multiple houses, right? That's when it's actually sold to individual households. Does that make sense? And so the idea here is that that's the way the sort of status quo is that it's vertically integrated like that. In California, they had a long, many years long process of having this very contentious debate about how to fix the energy market and how to introduce some competition into the market, knowing that this part here is a massive natural monopoly, really high fixed costs, really, really low per unit cost of the distribution and the retail. That's the cheap part, right? It's the expensive part is actually generating the electricity. And so what they did was they decided to do vertical unbundling, where they separated these two out and broke this down, and then created two different companies that would do the retail. One was the utility distribution company that was already there, and then the other one was the non-utility electric company. And it's not super important to remember the names or the acronyms. Don't get bogged down by that. But just remember the sort of basic rules of what happened. So the idea was that the utility distribution company had a fixed price, and then there was the non-utility, and they could also retail electricity to other people, but they didn't have a fixed price. Their prices were able to fluctuate up and down, and because they weren't the utility, they could also return customers back to the utility. And that was just sort of like a fail-safe, which was fine when everything worked perfectly. But in the summer of the 2000s, we saw higher energy prices, higher wholesale energy prices, so it's more expensive at the distribution level. And that meant that maybe because there were some companies withholding to try and raise prices, there was also rising costs associated with natural gas. We saw restrictions. We saw limited supply in the market, both internationally and domestically. And we saw higher costs of the permits associated with the pollution created by electricity generation. And so what that meant was, over here, the utility distribution companies, their price was fixed at $65 per kilowatt hour. Meanwhile, during the energy crisis, the wholesale price was going up to greater than $100. So that meant that the utilities were losing money on every kilowatt hour of energy distributed. So that's bad. And because of the vertical unbundling, they were competing with this non-utility provider that had the ability to raise and lower prices and return customers to the utility. And so that's where it went wrong. It's argued by a lot, mostly economists, but it's generally agreed that the vertical unbundling was not the problem. The real problem was the structure of it, the way the constraints were. And that's what we want to think about when we think about the lesson from this, is that it's not that the deregulation was wrong. It's that when we deregulate, we might create perverse incentives or problems through that process. You also want to think about this idea of vertical unbundling, of sort of taking it apart. And then the other idea after that was distributed generation. This idea that we could break the generation down and have, instead of one gigantic electricity generator, we could have lots of local electricity generators, and that would be low cost. And that could come from things like new technology, the way I have a neighbor down the street installing some big Tesla battery. That's going to allow them to rely less on the grid and more on themselves. If you have solar panels, you can rely less on the grid and more on yourself. And what we're talking about with the distributed generation is basically like smaller electrical grids, and that might create a little more competition too. So that's just a quick overview of that energy section. Hopefully that clears some stuff up. Let me know if you have any questions.